Since I was a child, I learned that the Sullivan surname carried power and influence. My father, Richard Sullivan, built an empire in the real estate sector, transforming forgotten plots into skyscrapers that pierced the New York skyline. He was admired, respected, and above all, a man of principles. If he said something would be done, it happened. If he made a promise, he kept it. His name was a guarantee of integrity, and to me, he was a hero. My mother, Victoria, however, was a completely different story. While my father built, she was concerned with flaunting. Luxurious dinners, designer dresses, trips to Europe just to buy a new handbag, everything in her life revolved around status. And what bothered me the most wasn't her love for luxury, but the way she saw people. To Victoria Sullivan, everyone was just a piece on a chessboard, useful only as long as they served a purpose. I became immune to her coldness very early on. Since childhood, I learned that her affection was nothing but a well-rehearsed act for when there was an audience. My father, on the other hand, always reminded me that true love didn't need spectators. He was my anchor in a home where my mother cared more about the appearance of the furniture than the happiness of her own family. My siblings, Lucas, Oliver, and Sophie, were different from me. They preferred to believe that our mother was just a demanding woman and not a natural manipulator. Lucas, the eldest, followed in our father's footsteps in business and was Victoria's favorite. Oliver, on the other hand, avoided conflict at all costs, and Sophie, the youngest, still couldn't see the truth about our mother. I tried to warn them from time to time, but it was like shouting in the middle of a hurricane. They simply refused to see it. The house we grew up in was an imposing mansion, filled with cold hallways and portraits of ancestors who watched us with their stern, piercing gazes. It was a place where smiles were practiced in front of the mirror before being displayed at social events. My father never fit in there, and neither did I. Over time, I started noticing things that unsettled me. My mother had always been indifferent to my father, but something changed in recent years. Her trips became more frequent, her phone conversations more hushed, and one name began to appear too often to be a coincidence: Ethan. It didn't take much to find out who he was. A renowned lawyer, charming and ambitious, too young for my mother, but interested enough to always be around. A man who knew how to play the game of manipulation just as well as she did. When I told my father, he simply smiled and shook his head. I expected outrage, anger, and immediate confrontation. But all he said was, "The truth always comes out, Charlotte, at the right time." I didn't know what that meant, but something in his tone sent chills down my spine. That's when things started to change. My father, who had always been strong, began to fall ill. At first, I thought it was just fatigue, the stress of business. But the symptoms worsened. He was thinner, weaker. The vibrant spark in his eyes seemed to fade a little more each day. The doctors tried to find an explanation, but the tests revealed nothing concrete. My father, however, seemed to know. And when he called me into his office one night, his expression made me realize he had already accepted what was coming. He took an envelope and placed it in my hands. "If something happens to me, Charlotte, you'll know what to do." Those words were etched into me. At that moment, something told me the worst was yet to come. The first time I realized that something was truly wrong was when I saw my father trying to climb the stairs at home, needing to support himself on the railing. He had always been a strong man, used to walking through New York as if he owned the city. But that day, he looked exhausted. There was something different in his face, a paleness that didn't suit him. His eyes carried a weariness that didn't come from work, but from something deeper, something that was draining his life little by little. At first, I thought it was just the weight of the years, but my father had never been a sick man. He maintained an impeccable routine, exercised regularly, and had a strict diet. Even at 59, he was agile and full of energy, or at least, he used to be. The illness crept in silently, without any drastic warnings. First, he started complaining about constant headaches. Then, his appetite diminished, and soon I noticed that his skin seemed to lose its glow. My father was no longer the same, and no matter how much he tried to downplay the situation, saying it was just fatigue, I knew something much more serious was happening. Doctors came and went from the house, always with vague answers. They said it could be stress, accumulated fatigue, or even some nutritional deficiency. But the vitamins and medications they prescribed did nothing. Each week, he seemed weaker. His suits had to be adjusted because they were too loose on his body. The wrinkles around his eyes were deeper. The man who had always taught me never to bow to anyone now seemed to carry an invisible burden on his shoulders. My mother, on the other hand, showed no concern. She cared more about high society, events, than the fact that her husband was clearly wasting away. When I brought it up with her, her response was always the same. "Your father is stubborn. If he doesn't want to rest, that's his problem." It was as if, to her, he had already become dead weight before he was even gone. My indignation grew each day, and the worst part was realizing that my siblings remained oblivious to everything. Lucas was too involved in the family business. Oliver avoided conflict as always, and Sophie was still too young to understand our mother's true coldness. It was on a rainy afternoon that my suspicion turned into real fear. I was leaving my father's office when I saw Victoria sitting in the living room, a glass of wine in hand and a discreet smile on her lips as she spoke on the phone. "Don't worry, Ethan. Everything is going as planned." My heart raced. She spoke to him in a tone that was far too intimate, as if they were accomplices in some sordid secret. I stood there, frozen, listening, trying to piece everything together. My father rapidly falling ill, Ethan always around. My mother showing no concern whatsoever. Something was wrong, very wrong. That same night, I went to my father's room. He was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, his expression serene but tired. When he saw me, he gave me a weak smile and gestured for me to come closer. I sat beside him and held his hand, feeling the coldness of his skin against mine. "Dad, are you sure this is just exhaustion?" He watched me for a moment, as if he knew I had already discovered more than I should have. "Charlotte, I know something is wrong, but some truths need time to reveal themselves." My throat tightened. "You can't just wait. I heard Mom on the phone. She was talking to Ethan. Something isn't right. What if—" He squeezed my hand, cutting me off. His gaze met mine, and within it, there was a mix of understanding and resignation. "Trust time. At the right moment, Charlotte. The truth always comes out." I closed my eyes for a moment. I wanted to scream, to ask why he wasn't fighting, why he seemed to accept all of this without reacting. But when I opened my eyes again, I saw that he was already too exhausted to argue. Just a few weeks later, my father passed away. And Victoria Sullivan didn't shed a single tear. A fine drizzle fell over the black umbrellas as the guests gathered around the closed casket. The air carried a suffocating weight, a feeling that something immense had been ripped from the world. My father was there, inside that noble wooden casket, and I still couldn't accept it. Everything felt like a blur. The silent condolences, the pitiful looks, the murmured words of comfort that meant nothing. But what bothered me the most wasn't the guests who spoke as if they had known my father intimately, nor the fake tears of some who were only there to keep up appearances. What truly made me nauseous was Victoria's indifference. My mother was impeccable. The black dress hugged her silhouette perfectly, her blonde hair tied in a sophisticated bun, her makeup untouched. Her blue eyes were dry, no tears, no trace of pain. While others looked at the ground, at the flowers on the casket, or at the cloudy sky, Victoria stared straight ahead, as if this moment was nothing more than a tedious protocol that needed to be followed before she could move on with her life. And then there was Ethan. He was there, discreetly positioned a few feet behind her. His gaze avoided mine, but I knew. He knew. The priest's speech was brief, the prayers were murmured, and soon the ceremony came to an end. The casket was slowly lowered, and my brothers threw handfuls of dirt over it. Lucas seemed the most shaken, his face rigid as he held back tears. Oliver remained silent the entire time, as if he were in shock. Sophie, my sweet and innocent sister, sobbed uncontrollably. My mother, however, didn't even look at the casket. She waited until everyone had stepped away, then walked toward the exit, arm in arm with Ethan. She walked as if she were leaving just another social event, without a second of hesitation, without looking back. That's when I heard her say it. Now I can finally live in peace with my boyfriend. That old man was long overdue. Now I can enjoy the inheritance without any worries. I stopped breathing for a moment. My stomach churned. My fingers clenched into fists so tightly that my nails dug into my skin. That was it. She didn't even bother to pretend. Not for a second. She was already preparing to leave, but before she could step through the church doors, I took a deep breath and called her name. She turned, surprised by the firmness in my voice. Her eyes locked onto mine, and then I waved the papers in the air. I think you should read this before celebrating too much. The smile on her lips vanished. Silence filled the room. All eyes turned to us. She snatched the papers from my hand and started reading, and I saw it. I saw the color drain from her face. I saw her fingers begin to tremble. I saw the certainty of her victory being replaced by absolute terror. The Queen was finally realizing she was about to fall. The silence inside the church was deafening. The voices that had whispered condolences, that had exchanged empty words about my father's passing, were now mute. Everyone was paying attention to what was unfolding before them. My mother clutched the papers tightly, as if just holding them could tear apart the truth written there. Her eyes scanned each line at lightning speed, her once impeccably made-up face now looking pale. Her chest rose and fell quickly, as if she were struggling to control her breathing. This couldn't be happening to her. Not here. Not in front of everyone. Her lips parted and closed a few times before any sound came out. "This must be a mistake," she said, her voice lower than usual. I crossed my arms, standing my ground. I had known this moment would come. My father had known. "It's no mistake," I replied, with the calm that she could no longer maintain. "My father knew about your betrayal for months. He knew that you and Ethan were waiting for the right moment to get rid of him and take the money. But he wasn't a fool, Victoria. You underestimated him." Her gaze met mine. Something different passed through her expression. Fear. She quickly turned to Ethan, expecting him to say something, to confirm that this was all a misunderstanding. But he said nothing. He stood still, rigid, his eyes restless. That was when she realized she was alone in this. "You did this," she spat, looking at me as if I were the enemy. "You poisoned your brothers against me." I stepped forward. I could feel all the eyes on me. I knew my brothers were hearing every word, absorbing every truth. But I wasn't doing this just for me. I was doing it for my father. "I didn't have to do anything," I responded. "You condemned yourself. When I found out what you did, I wanted to expose you right then and there. But do you know what stopped me? Dad. He told me that on the right day and at the right time, your mask would fall." The last words echoed inside the church, heavy, cutting. My brothers stood frozen. Oliver looked like he was in shock, as if everything around him was suddenly collapsing. Sophie's eyes were full of tears, and Lucas, always the most rational, was staring directly at Victoria, as if he were finally seeing her for who she truly was. It was he who broke the silence. "You tried to kill our father?" His voice wavered, filled with disbelief. Victoria opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her face, which once displayed an impenetrable confidence, now reflected something new. Fear. She looked at me again, as if she knew I had more to say. And I did. "Beyond the betrayal, he gathered enough evidence to show the lawyer that you tried to poison him," I continued, my voice firm. "The doctors may not have found the cause of his illness, but a specialist did. My father already suspected and took precautions. Tests were done. Everything is documented." Victoria staggered back a step. Ethan's eyes widened. He looked as if all the air had been knocked out of his body. The church doors opened. The sound of sirens cut through the silence like a sharp blade. My brothers turned toward the entrance, and then I saw it. 2 police officers marched toward us, their expressions serious, determined to do their job. Victoria finally understood. I saw the realization dawn on her face. I saw the exact moment she realized that no matter how much she tried to escape, her fate was already sealed. She stepped back. This wasn't part of her plans, but it was part of mine. The sound of the sirens still echoed in my head as the officers entered the church. Their firm, measured footsteps resonated against the marble floor, making the silence even heavier. My eyes remained fixed on Victoria, who was still gripping the papers tightly, as if holding them would be enough to change reality. But there was nowhere left to run. The murmurs began. People exchanged glances, shocked by the scene unfolding before them. Victoria Sullivan, the woman who had spent years crafting the perfect image of a devoted wife and high society figure, was now being confronted in front of everyone. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for a way out. But there was none. One of the officers, a tall man with a rigid expression, stepped forward and stopped right in front of her. "Victoria Sullivan, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Richard Sullivan." It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. The guests held their breath. My brothers seemed frozen in time. I felt a weight in my chest, but not for her, for my father, because justice was finally being served. Victoria's eyes widened, her body stiffening. Then, as if a survival instinct had kicked in, she took a step back, shaking her head. "This is a lie! This is absurd!" she shouted, her voice wavering, as if saying it aloud would be enough to convince someone. The officers remained unfazed. "We have concrete evidence, witness statements, and medical reports proving that your husband was being slowly poisoned," the officer continued, his voice cold and objective. "Charlotte." My mother turned to me, her eyes filled with uncontrolled rage. "You set this up. You want to destroy me." I bit the inside of my cheek, keeping my stance firm. "I didn't have to set up anything, Victoria. You did this to yourself." She looked around, hoping someone would intervene on her behalf, that someone would stand up and say this was all a mistake. But no one moved. Not the guests. Not my brothers. Lucas, always the most rational, was the first to break the silence. His voice was low, but it carried something I had never heard from him before. Disgust. "You tried to kill our father?" Victoria turned to him, her eyes wide, as if he had just said something ridiculous. "Lucas, sweetheart, you can't believe this," she said, her voice now sweet, false, manipulative. "These accusations are absurd. Your father died of natural causes. The doctors said so. You know I loved him." He didn't say anything. He just stared at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. Oliver averted his gaze as if he couldn't bear to look at her. Sophie was silently crying beside him. That was when Victoria turned to Ethan. Ethan, the man who had been by her side all this time. The accomplice. The lover. "Say something!" she demanded, gripping his arm tightly. But Ethan remained still. His face was paler than ever, his eyes locked on the officers, his jaw clenched. He felt the collapse happening around him, but he didn't know how to react. "You knew about this?" Lucas's voice cut through the silence, this time directed at Ethan. "Did you help her do this?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out, and then, as if trying to save himself, he took a step back, pulling away from Victoria's grasp. "I'm not getting involved in this," he said, barely above a whisper. He turned to leave, tried to walk toward the door as if he could simply disappear from the situation. But he had forgotten one small detail. Before he could take another step, another officer intercepted him, gripping his shoulder firmly. "Ethan Carter, you are under arrest for complicity." Panic spread across his face. "What?" His voice came out strangled. "We have evidence that you helped cover up information and were directly involved in the plan to poison Richard Sullivan. The calls, the financial transactions, everything has already been analyzed." He struggled, his eyes filled with desperation. "This is a mistake. I didn't know anything." Victoria, now looking distraught, turned to him, expecting some reaction. But Ethan only averted his gaze, refusing to look at her. And in that moment, she realized he wasn't going to help her. No one was. The officers began pulling them toward the exit, and in a last, desperate effort, Victoria turned to me. "Charlotte, please." Her voice came out trembling, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I am your mother. I took a deep breath. Now you remember that? She didn't have time to respond. The church doors opened, and the cold light from outside illuminated the path that would take her to the place where she should have been long ago. The church slowly emptied, but the weight of what had happened still lingered in the air. My brothers remained motionless, as if they needed more time to absorb the truth that had just been exposed. Lucas, always so sure of himself, sat on the bench with his hands clasped together, staring at the ground as if trying to find a rational explanation for everything. Oliver kept his distance, his gaze lost, unable to express any reaction. Sophie was still quietly crying, gripping a handkerchief with trembling fingers. As for me, I felt no pleasure in seeing Victoria and Ethan being dragged out in handcuffs. There was no satisfaction in the panic overtaking their expressions, nor in my mother's despair as she realized that no one would come to her rescue. All I felt was a deep sense of relief, the kind of relief that comes when a massive weight is lifted off your shoulders. For months, I had lived with the feeling that the truth was buried beneath layers of lies and manipulation. Now, finally, everything was in plain sight. The murmurs of the remaining guests echoed through the room. Some approached to offer their condolences, while others simply avoided eye contact, embarrassed to have witnessed Victoria's facade crumble before their eyes. Her reputation, the luxurious life she valued so much, everything collapsed in a matter of minutes. And now, as she was led away by the police, she had no control over anything anymore. I stepped closer to my brothers, sensing that there was still much left unsaid between us. Lucas was the first to lift his head. His eyes met mine, and there was something different in them. No more doubt, no more hesitation, just acceptance. You knew all along? His voice sounded tired but held no aggression. I suspected, I answered, honestly. But I got confirmation when Dad's lawyer handed me the documents. He knew something was wrong, Lucas. He knew that Victoria wasn't just an unfaithful wife. She was trying to kill him. He ran a hand over his face, exhausted, as if his mind was still struggling to hold on to any shred of normalcy. Oliver, who had remained silent for far too long, finally spoke. I can't believe she would be capable of something like this, he murmured, shaking his head. She's our mother. She was never a mother, I replied without hesitation. She was a woman driven by ambition. Nothing was ever enough for her, not us, not Dad. In the end, the only thing that ever mattered to Victoria Sullivan was money. Sophie sniffled, wiping her tears with the crumpled handkerchief. The look of disappointment on her face was unmistakable. Why didn't you tell us sooner? She asked, her voice small and broken. I took a deep breath before answering. Because Dad asked me to wait. He said the truth would come out at the right moment. I wanted to act sooner. I wanted to scream to the world who she really was, but he made me promise to wait. Lucas nodded, absorbing everything. So that's why he changed the will, he murmured. Yes, I confirmed. He knew that if he left everything to her, it wouldn't take long for her to squander it all with Ethan and get rid of us. He wanted to make sure we were protected. At tea. That moment, memories of my father flooded my mind. I remembered his tired eyes, our last conversation, the way he had held my hand and told me to trust time. He knew he wouldn't be able to stop what was happening, but he found a way to make sure the truth didn't die with him. My heart ached. My father was a strong man, but even he couldn't escape the woman he chose to love. Lucas stood up, running, a hand through his hair. We have a lot to sort out, he said, looking at me seriously. I know. But before anything else, we need to make sure Dad's name is remembered for the man he was, not for the tragedy that happened to him. I nodded. We had a legacy to protect, and above all, we had a name to rebuild. The days that followed were a storm of news reports, headlines, and endless phone calls. The scandal took over newspapers, TV programs, and social media. Socialite. Victoria Sullivan arrested for attempted murder of her own husband. Betrayal, poison, and power. The dark secrets of the Sullivan family. No matter where I looked, my mother's name was plastered everywhere, now associated with shame and ruin. Victoria was formally indicted and would face trial. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Medical reports showed the poison accumulating in my father's body over the months, and the financial transactions between her and Ethan left no doubt about their intentions. Her defense attorney tried to argue that it was all a setup, that she was being falsely accused, but it was too late. There was no alibi, no justification. Ethan Carter, on the other hand, tried to negotiate a deal. He claimed he had only followed orders, that Victoria was the mastermind behind everything. But the investigation showed that not only did he know, but he also helped cover up evidence. His attempt to save himself didn't work. He was convicted along with her, and ironically, the woman he had shared a bed with would now share the same fate behind bars. The Sullivan Mansion was put up for sale. None of us wanted to keep a place that only held distant memories of a family that was never real. My siblings and I decided to split the money from the sale, but for me, this was never about money. It was about justice. Lucas took over the family business. He had always been the most rational and capable for the job, and I knew he would make sure our father's name was remembered as a symbol of integrity, not for the scandal caused by Victoria. Oliver, after everything, decided to take time for himself. He had always lived in the shadow of our parents' conflict, trying to avoid taking sides, and now he needed a fresh start, far from all of this. Sophie, the youngest of us, was still processing the pain of betrayal, but little by little she was finding her own voice. And me? I returned to my father's office, the same office where, weeks before his death, he had handed me that envelope and asked me to trust time. I sat in the leather chair where he used to sit, ran my fingers across the desk, feeling the weight of his absence. I looked around. The bookshelves filled with the books he read every night, the framed pictures from our childhood, the perfectly organized documents. This office still breathed his essence. I picked up one of the framed photos. It was of me and him on my graduation day. I was smiling, and he had that unmistakable look of pride in his eyes. I let out a long sigh, holding the frame against my chest. Life had stolen too much time from us, taken away moments that could never be recovered. But somehow, I knew my father was still here, in every decision we made to honor his memory. I stood up and placed the frame back where it belonged. I knew this wasn't just the story of the downfall of a family corrupted by greed. It was the story of the beginning of something new. My father was right. At the right time, the truth always comes out.